Powers Mansion was built in Nevada in the early 1860s by a wealthy couple known as the Powers family. They made their fortune from the Comstock lode during the silver boom. The mansion was large, with fine furnishings and large rooms, and quickly became a popular landmark in the area. Unfortunately, the Powers' success did not last. After a few years they ran into financial trouble and lost most of their money. Her husband died, and soon after, the couple's children also died at an early age. His wife was left alone and tried to support herself throughout her life. The mansion was eventually abandoned and began to deteriorate. In 1946, Washoe County purchased the mansion and renovated it. It was turned into a museum so visitors could come and learn about its history. By the 1950s, people began reporting strange happenings in the house. Some said they were just old ghost stories, but others believed there was something real in what they saw and heard. The first known story occurred in July 1954. A Reno family visited the mansion on a guided tour. As they walked, they noticed a woman standing on the second-floor balcony. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothing and appeared to be looking at the house. When the family asked the clerk about the woman, they were told that no one was in the building that day. The family was confused and claimed to have seen him clearly. Later that year, in October, a local teacher brought a group of students to the palace for a history lesson. The group was wandering around the rooms when two students left the main group. They later reported seeing someone moving quickly in one of the upstairs corridors. They thought it was another classmate or co-worker, but when they rejoined the group, they realized no one had left. The teacher dismissed their story as a misunderstanding, but the students refused to back down. Their accounts were detailed and closely matched. In 1961, a group of college students also had a strange experience. They said they saw a figure standing in an upstairs window when they arrived for the tour. When they asked about it, staff explained that no one else was in the mansion at the time. One student later said the figure resembled a woman from an old photo he had seen of the Bauer family. That same year, an employee reported hearing footsteps while cleaning the main salon after hours. He checked the rooms one by one, thinking that someone had stayed after the museum closed. He found nothing. According to him, the footsteps continued until he left the building. After that, he refused to work alone in the palace. In addition to the sightings, employees began to notice other strange events. In 1973, a palace guard named Daniel wrote in his diary that he heard footsteps on the second floor when he locked the palace alone at night. The steps were slow and steady and seemed to move across the floor above him. Every time he went upstairs to check, the rooms were empty. Daniel also noticed that objects like chairs or exhibits would sometimes move from their places at night, even though the building was locked and no one was inside. He noted that this happened 3 nights in a row in August. In the late 1980s, visitors and staff began hearing children's laughter. One of the most famous cases occurred in 1987 when a school group from Carson City toured the mansion. While they were gathered in the main room, several students reported hearing laughter from above. Their teacher thought they were playing a prank, but several students insisted they heard it. A few days later, the museum director reviewed the security footage of the visit. Although there was nothing unusual in the video, there were faint sounds in the background that sounded like laughter. Meanwhile, another employee witnessed a series of inexplicable events. He recalled locking the doors to the upstairs bedroom at the end of the day, only to return in the morning to find them unlocked. At first, he assumed the wind or something else was to blame, but the pattern continued for several weeks. Other employees began to notice it, too. One evening, he returned again to lock the doors, having already occupied the building earlier in the day, but when he checked the next morning, the doors were still unlocked. No one could explain why it continued. In 1992, a local news crew came to the mansion to film a segment about its history. They interviewed staff and filmed various parts of the house. Later, when they reviewed the recordings, they discovered a strange sound on one of the audio tracks. A voice was heard as the woman quietly said, "They're gone now." The recording was made late at night when the museum was closed and no one was present. The crew checked their equipment but could not determine the source of the sound. The following year, a group of paranormal investigators from Reno conducted a nighttime study of the mansion. They installed equipment including audio recorders and temperature monitors. During the investigation, they heard footsteps on the second floor, but when they searched the place, it was empty. One of the investigators claimed to have seen movement in the hallway briefly, but there was nothing visible on their cameras. They also recorded faint laughter sounds on their audio devices during the night. They could not explain what happened. Over time, similar stories continued to occur. Some thought they were just a figment of the imagination or the ancient creaks and sounds of an old building. But others weren't so sure. Staff and visitors have reported the same events for years: footsteps, laughter, and the sight of a figure dressed in old-fashioned clothing. Even those who didn't believe in ghosts had a hard time explaining the experience. Several staff members ended up experiencing strange events as part of their work at Bowers Mansion. One longtime guide said that while the experiences were strange, they didn't seem harmful. Despite its gruesome reputation, the mansion remains a popular destination for its history. Visitors to the mansion today are asked to enter its rooms with an open mind. Most people don't see or hear anything out of the ordinary, but a few leave behind stories that match those told over the past 70 years. True or not, the Bowers Mansion continues to make people wonder what really happened. Commentary by Stephen Kammer. The Segway 2-story The Curse of the Wendigo. In 1876, a small farming family in northern Minnesota faced what they believed was a curse that would follow their family for generations. The story begins with George Jr., a poor farmer who moved his family to a remote property near a national forest. The land was cheap and had been vacant for years, but George thought it was his chance to start over. According to scant information, George found an old cemetery while clearing trees near his property. Local tribes warned settlers not to disturb certain parts of the forest, but George ignored the warnings. He dug up the area, removed the items he found, and continued working. Then, strange and terrible things began to happen. Neighbors later reported that within a few weeks, George's farm animals began to die under strange circumstances. His horses became weak, his cows stopped producing milk, and his chickens suddenly died in their barn. Local veterinarians examined the animals, but found no obvious disease or cause of death. Records show that George blamed bad soil and tried planting them elsewhere on his property, but nothing grew. Either the crops withered prematurely or were consumed by unusual numbers of pests not seen on other farms. George borrowed money to buy new livestock and seeds, but lost it within months. Over time, George's behavior changed. He worked days without sleep, wandering the fields and muttering to himself. Neighbors noticed that he stopped attending church and town meetings. One neighbor, Henry L., said that he once found George late at night digging trenches near a tree line on his property. George reportedly told her he was going to bury the bad earth, but offered no other explanation. Around this time, George's wife, Ellen, wrote letters to relatives about the disturbance in the house, saying that George was becoming like a stranger. Soon Ellen and their 2 children fell ill. Doctors thought it was a common illness, but no medication helped. Finally, Ellen took her children and left the farm. She returned to the family home in a nearby town, but George refused to leave. Historical records indicate that George remained alone for about a year before he was forced to leave after the bank foreclosed on the land. By then he had nothing left. She soon disappeared from local records. In the decades that followed, George's descendants faced similar patterns of misfortune. Family documents and accounts show recurring struggles, financial setbacks, sudden illness, and broken relationships. Relatives spoke of unusual aggression that could come out of nowhere, or paranoia that made them distrust others. Some even experienced unexplained physical fatigue, rapidly losing weight despite eating normally. These symptoms often appeared without warning and were not related to any diagnosed illness. In 1964, George's grandson, Raymond, unknowingly moved the family to a house several miles from George's old property. The house was cheap and close to Raymond's job, but within months of moving in, his life reportedly began to unravel. At first, Raymond isolated himself. Neighbors said he stopped waving at them and came closer. His family noticed him leaving the house at odd hours, sometimes disappearing into the nearby woods without explanation. Around this time, Raymond's health took a turn for the worse. His wife and children noticed that he was eating regularly, but was rapidly losing weight. Doctors could not find the cause. He was eventually admitted to hospital for tests, but nothing was found. Shortly before his death, Raymond's son said his father was obsessed with something he couldn't talk about, staring out windows or sitting in silence for hours. Raymond's son Michael became the first to investigate the strange events around the family. By 1987, he traces their history back to George and finds property records indicating that George had cleared the burial site. Through letters and local stories, Michael pieces together what happened and becomes convinced that his great-grandfather's actions have placed a curse on the family. Michael researches the Wendigo, a creature from northern folklore associated with greed and destruction. He found accounts of people who were said to be physically and mentally exhausted after disturbing the sacred grounds. The details of these stories matched what had happened to his father, grandfather, and other relatives. Determined to break the curse, Michael spoke to a local tribal elder in 1988. The sheik told him that the only way to end this was through pure self-sacrifice, something done without reward, as victims were given freely. Michael began to implement this advice. In 1988, he sold his house, donated all the money to charity, and moved his family into a small trailer. He refused to tell anyone where the money went, saying only that it was something that had to be done. Over the next 2 years, Michael volunteered at local food banks and homeless shelters. He refused to be paid and refused to give credit. People who knew him said Michael was focused but reticent to talk about why he made these changes in his life. By 1990, things were looking up for Michael. He and his wife found steady work and were able to afford a modest home. For the first time in generations, none of the family's descendants suffered from unexplained illness, accidents, or failures. Michael's children grew up healthy and financially secure, eventually starting families of their own. People close to Michael claimed that the bad luck that had plagued the family for so long had simply stopped. Years later, in 2005, a researcher visited the property where George's farm once stood. The land had been abandoned, overgrown, and untouched for decades. The remains of the cemetery were still visible in the woods, though much of it had been reclaimed by nature. Locals told the researcher they were avoiding the area, repeating the same warnings from a century earlier: the land was not meant for them. The story of the Georgi family and the alleged curse remains unexplained. Some dismiss it as a coincidence or family myth, while others see it as evidence of something real. Whether curse, misfortune, or folklore, the events that have plagued the family for over a century only ended with the self-immolation. The curse of the Wendigo remains an unsolved mystery. Some believe it is fiction. Others believe it is true. Stephen's on-camera commentary, Segue 3. The Siren Story. In June 2011, a journalist named Sarah began investigating a series of disappearances near an old military base called Fort Hayward. The base was in a remote area and has been closed since the 1980s. It was originally built during World War II and was used to test radio communication systems. Although the base has been closed for years, many of the old sirens, used for warnings and emergencies, still stand in the surrounding area. 6 people have gone missing within 5 miles of the base in the past 2 years. Police searched the area but found nothing. The case had not received much attention, but Sarah became interested after reading a post on a local online forum. In the post, people claimed to hear sirens in the woods at odd times, especially late at night. Since there was no power at the abandoned base, most people thought it was just a rumor. Sarah decided to see for herself. On June 14, Sarah left for Fort Hayward. She brought a tent, a camera, and a tape recorder. She set up camp outside the fence surrounding the base. During the day, she explored the outside areas. The base itself was locked down, but the sirens remained, some attached to buildings, others alone in the overgrown grass. Sarah noted in her notes that some of the sirens looked remarkably new, even though the rest of the base was falling apart. Sarah began documenting everything she could. She checked for signs of old life, like remnants of fire or ruins, but she didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Most of the buildings were boarded up or in ruins and showed no signs of recent human activity. He tried to get a closer look at the sirens and found that many still had wires attached to their bases despite the lack of a functioning power source. He tried to take pictures of the connections, but realized that some of the angles were too difficult to get a clear shot. He walked the perimeter for hours, noting the places where the sirens seemed to be working most effectively. The next night, Sarah woke up at 2 a.m. and heard a faint noise in the distance. At first she thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder and clearer. It wasn't a normal siren, it sounded like an old radio struggling to tune to the right station. When Sarah left the tent, the sound stopped. He couldn't figure out where it was coming from. The next day, Sarah decided to take a closer look at the sirens. She took pictures and noticed that many of them didn't look damaged at all, even though they had been there for decades. She also tried using a voice recorder while walking around the sirens, but she couldn't pick up any sounds. He noted that when he approached some of the sirens, he felt a strange pressure in his head that went away when he stepped back. He spent several hours testing it, walking around various sirens and noting how he felt. The results were inconsistent, but it happened enough that he wrote about it. That night he returned to the tent, but felt strange. He wrote that he felt weak and could not move for long periods of time, even though he was awake. Around 3 a.m., the noise returned. This time it was a deep, low siren sound that came in waves. Sarah wrote that she could not move her body at all when the sound occurred, as if something was blocking her. After a few minutes the noise stopped and he was able to move again. The next morning, Sarah noticed that her camera battery was dead, even though it had been fully charged the day before. Her voice recorder also stopped working. He felt sick and had a headache, but decided to stay another night. He moved his tent closer to one of the larger sirens and hid it behind some trees. Sarah spent the last day trying to get recordings of the sirens during daylight hours. He sat near several sirens with his equipment on standby, waiting to capture any strange noises or sounds. He noted in his journal that one siren made a silent clicking sound as it passed, but when he tried to record it, nothing was recorded. He checked his equipment and couldn't find an explanation for why it wasn't working. He also wrote that he was getting more tired as the day progressed, and was taking frequent breaks, which he usually avoided while working on the story. Sarah's last journal entry described what happened that night. Around midnight, the siren closest to him began to blare as low as ever. This time he saw something he hadn't noticed before. The siren horn, which he thought was stuck in place, began to move. The metal bent as if searching for something. The sound grew louder and Sarah felt her whole body freeze. He wrote that he couldn't move or look away until he got back to the tent. It took hours to pack up and get back to the car. He left most of his gear behind. Sarah returned home the next day, but continued to feel sick for weeks. He never wrote an official article about what happened. Instead, he posted a short story about it on the paranormal message board 4chan. In the post, He said that the sirens at Fort Hayward were alive and used radio waves to paralyze people before attacking them. He warned others to stay away from the base. The post was quickly deleted and his account was banned. Sarah stopped working as a journalist after that, and no one knows what happened to her. Years later, 3 months ago, his notes and some photos were published anonymously. We tried to confirm his story, but police and local officials say there was nothing out of the ordinary at Fort Hayward. They claim the sirens haven't been activated for decades. Even today, hikers who visit the area occasionally report hearing sirens late at night, but no official reports have been filed. The 6 missing people were never found and no one knows for sure what happened to them. Was Sarah imagining things? Or was he telling the truth about something dangerous lurking in the abandoned base? We'll let you decide.
And so, the story ends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell button to receive all the stories. Like, share and rate the story in a comment. Thank you for watching.